Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar on navigating head and neck cancer clinical trials. It is jointly presented by the Head and Neck Cancer Alliance and the American Head and Neck Society. My name is Nicole Schmitt. I'm a head and neck surgeon and associate professor of otolaryngology at Emory University School of Medicine. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today to talk about the importance of clinical trials as an option for head and neck cancer and how clinical trials advance research and treatment alternatives. So to begin, I'd like to thank everybody for joining the webinar, and also I'd like to introduce each of our panels, starting with our survivors. So first I'll introduce Tom Bennett, who's a 8-year survivor of HPV-associated tongue-based cancer. Tom was diagnosed at stage 4 and accepted into a clinical trial that took 1 week off the standard 7-week treatment. He had a chemotherapy infusion with cisplatin every Monday and radiation treatments Monday through Friday. Over those 6 weeks, he lost his taste and his appetite and a lot of weight and a lot of motivation, but he endured. And following his clinical trial treatment, he did undergo a neck dissection to remove the mass in his neck that remained after treatment. His recovery went fairly well, and his new life as a cancer survivor began. Our other survivor joining us today is Mr. Bill Kaysen, who his journey started as a seemingly healthy 50-year-old man, happily married with 3 wonderful kids, when he was diagnosed in 2019 with stage 2 tongue cancer. Bill also entered a 2-month clinical trial. And as a commercial pilot, Bill is back to flying and feels very grateful for the doctors who changed his care. I'd then like to introduce Dr. Ari Rosenberg. Dr. Rosenberg is a medical oncologist specializing in the treatment of head and neck cancer. He's also an assistant professor of medicine at the University of Chicago, where he develops and leads clinical trials focused on identifying new treatments and biomarkers, which are tests that help select the right treatment for the right patient. Dr. Rosenberg has a particular focus on incorporating new treatments such as immunotherapies in combination with other therapies to improve the effectiveness and also to decrease the short and long-term side effects associated with head and neck cancer treatment. I'd also like to introduce Mr. Jack Gierlich, who's the head of marketing at Leal Health. And Jack will be talking a little bit about the head and neck clinical trials finder that can be used to find particular head and neck trials. And I'll let each of our panelists speak individually, after which we are going to welcome any questions that you might have. Feel free to put them in the chat or the question and answer box, and we can answer some of those individually, and also some of those we'll pose to the panelists and answer together. So with that, I'd like to turn it over first to Tom to tell his story a bit.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody for participating today. Yeah, 2015 was kind of going as a good year, and I got kind of blindsided by obviously a mass growth on my neck. Went to a variety of doctors, and unfortunately at that time there was not a lot of information. I went to a dentist, maxillofacial, went to a variety of general practitioner, and it wasn't until I had that surreal moment of going to the radiation oncologist and also the ENT to determine that I did have a tumor at the base of my tongue. And that's when my life obviously changed. The good news is I was treated at Smilow Cancer Center at Yale New Haven, and they did a pretty good protocol of telling you what you needed to do. They did tell me that the treatment was going to be harsh, was going to be grueling, but that the potential success of that was pretty high. Right towards the beginning of it, they came to me and said, "Hey, look, we've got this opportunity of a clinical trial. One of two, we don't know which one you'll be put in, but one would actually reduce the chemo and radiation to 6 weeks versus 7. And the other one would have opted me into just a straight radiation one." I ultimately got the one with the radiation and chemotherapy. And what was interesting about that, and obviously you already heard about the protocol of my treatment, but as a head cancer ambassador, I've had the opportunity to answer questions for people going through treatment. And more specifically, I would say in the last year, I had a gentleman who sought me out, and I actually had an opportunity to really talk to him weekly. And the difference that I noticed, especially going into the 7th week of the chemotherapy and the radiation, was he had a very, very difficult time. And I reflected upon myself how fortunate I was, not only to be able to reduce my treatment by the 1 week, but the really difficult time that he had. So the interesting point was I really just stumbled upon the clinical trial. I didn't have the portal that would be available to people today, which is a good thing. And along with that, I'm thankful that by having one less week of the chemotherapy, which unfortunately did slightly damage my kidney, and also 5 more rads of radiation, and the pain and the radiation associated with that can be very, very difficult. So I'm fortunate with that. And along with that, I had a very strong-willed oncologist that even though that after my treatment, I did still have a little bit of a mass left on my neck. She did recommend that I have a neck dissection, which I did do, which did result in having a lymph node tested a little bit positive for cancer. So with that said, that's kind of my my experience for those that are going through it now. There is an end. There's a good end to it, and you just have to kind of grind through it, have a good support group, and have good organizations like the Head and Cancer Alliance that can kind of give you the answers that you need to have. So I'll be happy to answer any questions later and turn it back to the group.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'll let Bill tell his story as well, and thank you both for sticking around to answer questions afterward.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and I think this is a great step, and I really think this is excellent for those going through treatment or facing the possibility of treatment. My story is going to mirror Tom's a lot, and I thank him for his nice narrative there too. For me, it was the same kind of deal. I had a hard node here in my neck, on the right side of my neck, that was not bilateral. It certainly concerned me. And I was in the same kind of boat as Tom. I went through probably a longer road than I should have to get to where a good diagnosis. And that finally came with a scope and with an ENT, and that set me on the journey for treatment. If I had to give a recommendation, or one of them would be that probably that ENT is a good place to start as opposed to finish. For me, same kind of thing. I was diagnosed with cancer on the right base of my tongue, which is HPV related cancer. And really day one was offered, I was lucky to go to an excellent hospital in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, UT Southwestern, which is a teaching hospital and participates in a lot of clinical trials for all kinds of medical problems. And really on day one, I was offered this particular trial, which uses, and of course I'm not a physician, but it uses artificial intelligence and to focus the treatment, radiation treatment, on the affected nodes as opposed to maybe the entire neck. And the way it was described to me was that the idea, the hope was that I would, have in the aggregate be exposed to less radiation with as effective of a treatment plan. That's something that's concerning to me. Obviously, I'm a commercial airline pilot, as stated in my introduction, and we receive a lot of radiation up there at 35,000 feet. And so, I balanced the idea of having less radiation through treatment with also probably having more scans to see how the clinical trial was progressing. So in the end, I was glad to participate. I'm 3 years now out of treatment with no signs of any disease, and thankful for that. And also thankful to be in this organization and be mentoring some other folks going through similar diagnosis. So again, happy to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to participate. And if I could answer any questions, I'm glad to do that.
Thank you so much, Bill. I appreciate that. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Rosenberg to tell us a little bit more about clinical trials for head and neck cancer.
Great. Thanks so much, Nikki, and everyone really on the call. And particularly thank you to Bill and Tom for sharing your stories and serving in this important role. You of course understand firsthand how head and neck cancer treatment can really be challenging, and it takes a lot. And I know my patients really appreciate the support from other patients who have gone through it or are going through it. That's really, really important. So thank you for that, and to everyone on the call. I was charged with speaking a little bit about clinical trials in general in head and neck cancer and how to think about that as a patient or support for patients undergoing what is quite daunting, which is a head and neck cancer diagnosis. And as Nikki mentioned in her introduction, I'm a medical oncologist focusing on head and neck cancer. And I also do clinical trials as well. So I'll start off by talking very generally about head and neck cancer, which is that, the goals of us who treat head and neck cancer are really to, number one, optimize chances of cure and survival, which, whenever we, think about cancer in general is of the utmost importance. But the other important component, which you heard a little bit about from the clinical trials that Tom and Bill did, actually are about also optimizing function and quality of life, because of head and neck is different than other parts of the body, and the places that cancer can arise, which you can see on the cartoon on this slide as well. And of course, the treatments to that area can have major impacts, both in the short term in terms of side effects, as well as longer term. And so many of the clinical trials are focused on really these two goals, which is number one, how do we cure and help patients with head and neck cancer diagnoses live as long as possible? And number two, with as good as of function and quality of life as possible. And I think we really think about three sort of categories of tools in our toolbox that we use to try and optimize these outcomes. So, number one is, systemic therapy. So these are drugs that are used to treat cancer. And those are the ones that, are most, that's what's in our wheelhouse as the medical oncologists of the treatment team. And then, of course, the other tools are radiation therapy, which you heard a little bit about both from Tom and Bill and their story in radiation oncologists that quarterback that piece of the treatment. And of course, surgery, and I'll say surgery very broadly because it's not always a big surgery. Sometimes it's optimizing the multidisciplinary care, which Dr. Schmitt and other ENT and head and neck surgeons do as part of their treatment. So the question becomes, how do we combine the tools that we have, both in terms of standard and in terms of clinical trials, new ways of looking at treatment to really optimize survival while reducing treatment-related toxicity and optimizing quality of life. And so we do that at our center and also at other centers such as the Yale group or the UT Southwestern group or the Emory group, which are all represented here. In terms of a multidisciplinary team is really important for head and neck cancer, regardless of whether you're on a trial or not. These are the three main oncologists that sort of quarterback the care, which is the ENT head and neck surgeon, radiation oncologist, medical oncologist. But of course, the treatment team and the supportive components of that are also very important, including a long list of specialists, which you can see there. And I'm sure both Bill and Tom can tell you, how important, for example, nutritional support and speech and swallowing therapy and dentistry and physical medicine and specialized nursing care, how all those play into treatment and really are important regardless of the treatment path that I think a patient goes down. So what are clinical trials? Well, clinical trials are basically acknowledging the reality, the humble reality, which is that our treatments are suboptimal. Right? We all wish that we could cure everyone with no side effects, both in the short term and the long term. But of course, we know that with current treatments, that's not possible. And so clinical trials is really about developing treatments that move us closer to that goal, right? Which is improving treatments for in this case, head and neck cancer. So, there's a number of different potential goals that we could have as part of new treatment strategies. One is, of course, improved treatment efficacy. So that means treatments that work better against cancer than the current standard treatments. That can oftentimes involve novel therapies, so new treatments that maybe work differently than current treatments, or maybe are more targeted or use more new technologies, like you heard about from Bill's story. Sometimes in trials that use new tests, or the other word for that is biomarkers. Those are tests that are being developed to figure out what the right treatment is for the right patient, for example. Reducing toxicity, reducing side effects of treatment, both short-term and long-term, are very important. And then improving function and quality of life. These are all some of the potential goals that we think about when we're thinking about evaluating new treatment programs for head and neck cancer. So this is the official definition. I won't read it verbatim, but basically clinical trials are the way that we in the head and neck cancer treatment realm evaluate new treatments to treat head and neck cancer that we hope will ultimately leave us with a better treatment than the current standard. That's really the way that I would think about that. And of course, evaluating it better includes, evaluating safety and side effects, as well as effectiveness, how well it works in patients. And so that is, sort of how the NIH, the National Institute of Health, really define a clinical trial. And when we think about how new treatments are developed, we generally think about it in phases. So we generally think about, this is sort of a cartoon that sort of illustrates the way that we think about the different phases of a clinical trial. And, you may be, as a patient with head and neck cancer, depending on your situation and your prognosis and your anticipated outcome and current standards, maybe, recommended for one versus a different phase of a clinical trial. But generally, the story of a new treatment starts usually at the left here with early ongoing discovery and preclinical research. So this is really before treatments are evaluated in patients with head and neck cancer, sometimes with mouse models or animal models or in the lab, to really figure out, before we evaluate new treatments in patients, how likely it is to work using, cancer cells and looking, before we evaluate it in patients. That's very important because we want to have the treatments that are most likely to benefit patients be the ones that ultimately are brought into the clinic to actually, have be evaluated in patients with head and neck cancer to see if they can be better and make things better. Once a new treatment is identified as a potential candidate, then that goes into phase 1 clinical trials, or sometimes people call it first in human clinical trials. So this is really the first time that a new treatment is evaluated in a patient with head and neck cancer. And, I'll say a couple things about this. First of all, this is really to evaluate, number one, safety, right? We want to make sure that new treatments are safe for patients. And oftentimes also trying to figure out what the best dose is for patients in terms of not only safety and side effects, but also in terms of identifying a dose that we think is going to be most likely to be the one that's going to be most effective against the cancer. And these are often trials where all the patients are getting the treatment. Oftentimes, these are trials that, as much as we wish it wasn't the case, are enrolling patients with very advanced cancer without good treatment options, with the hopes that this will, move the needle forward for cancer, head and neck cancer treatment. Phase 2 is generally once the safety and the right dose is identified and is evaluated in a larger number of patients to get an idea in a not a huge number of patients, but a reasonable number of patients, how well the treatment works, oftentimes comparing with a historical standard of treatment. And then if a treatment looks promising in a phase 2 trial, that's when it moves into a phase 3 trial. And a phase 3 trial is really where we are comparing a new treatment against the current standard treatment. And oftentimes this is the kind of trial that's done in a randomized fashion. That means that patients enroll and they get sort of a coin flip randomization to either the new treatment or the standard treatment, and are evaluated that oftentimes with the goal of trying to see if the new treatment will help patients live longer, or in the cases of some of these other trials like Bill and Tom were involved with, reduce the side effects without compromising, survival and things like that. And, randomization is really important in this stage. And I say that because it's not always easy, I think, as a patient. And I talk to my patients about this, about the idea that, they don't know whether they're going to get a standard treatment or a new treatment. But, this is the only way with the least amount of bias to figure out if a new treatment is better than the current standard treatment. And so it remains an important part of it. And so that's the phase 3 trial. And then phase 4 is actually after a drug or a new treatment has been shown to be superior, becomes a standard treatment with everyone having access to that treatment. But still, despite that, and despite it being marketed, remains, an important surveillance for side effects or potentially, very rare side effects that maybe weren't identified in the other earlier phases, which remains very important. So even after it's marketed, the data continues to be assessed to make sure that the new treatment is really a good treatment. So this is sort of the story of how a drug is developed. This is how we as head and neck cancer doctors and a head and neck cancer community move the needle forward to improve outcomes for head and neck cancer patients. So I'm just going to give sort of a brief overview of a recent story relating to a new treatment and sort of how this moved through these different phases and ultimately led to a new approved therapy that now head and neck cancer patients in the right setting have access to. So the example here is immune therapy. So many of the people on this call may have heard about immune therapy. It's actually been a big innovation in the cancer, not just in head and neck cancer, but also other types of cancer over the last really over a decade now. Actually, it's not quite so new. It used to be brand new, and now it's not quite so new anymore. But immune therapy are basically drugs or strategies, I'll say, to harness the power of the body's immune system to attack cancer. And it's actually something that many scientists have worked on for a long time and was actually unsuccessful for a long time until one type of immune therapy, which was the success story in head and neck cancer, related to this one protein that relates between tumor cells and immune cells called PD-1, PDL1, or programmed death 1 or programmed death ligand 1. So, the way to think about this is basically like the brakes that tumor cells put on the body's immune system. It's a strategy that tumor cells use to evade a patient's immune system and prevent it from dying on behalf of the immune system, which is trying to kill anything that's trying to harm a person or a patient. And at least for head and neck cancer, this manifested itself with drugs that were developed that basically are able to target these brakes on the immune system, which are sort of analogous to releasing the brakes on the immune system to allow the immune system to go and attack the cancer, to release those brakes. And this was initially developed in the lab, and identified as a very promising cancer treatment, both for head and neck cancer and other cancer treatments, and to the point where it was decided that it was worth evaluating this in head and neck cancer patients. And so this led to an early phase clinical trial. So this is sort of phase 1, phase 2 that I sort of talked about, which is evaluating this new treatment in head and neck cancer patients that unfortunately had already progressed on standard therapies that are known to be effective without other good treatment options. And these are the patients that really enrolled on this particular clinical trial. You can see here that it was a drug called pembrolizumab, which is one of the drugs that targets the immune system in this way. Initially, you can see that the dose actually changed, as part of the early clinical trial development. And so this was the early phase clinical trial. And, the clinical trial medical oncologists who were working on this trial ultimately identified this as a treatment that obviously worked, right? Because, this is unfortunately a group of cancer patients that did not have a great prognosis and, started to see responses, deep responses, regression of tumors, things that would not be expected, with a new treatment. And more importantly, patients were living longer than expected. So really a signal of a treatment that works. And this ultimately led after phase 2 and then phase 3 studies as treatments that improved survival or helped patients live longer. And since that time, there's been 2 different actually immune therapies that have been approved by the FDA, pembrolizumab and nivolumab, both of which work similarly, either alone or in combination with chemotherapy. including with a marker that actually can be assessed on the tumor called PD-L1 that can help predict how likely a patient is to benefit or not to benefit. So, really a large step forward in patients with recurrent, head and neck cancer that's come back or is not amenable to the types of treatments that you heard about from Tom and Bill, that really help patients live longer. And so this is my last slide here because I want to make sure that we leave enough time. But, this is how clinical trials work, which is how do we identify treatments that are better, either work better, reduce side effects, or both. And this is just sort of some examples of how we think about current treatments and future treatments. In terms of new immune therapies are some examples of some of the clinical trials. Using the current immune therapies in new treatment settings as part of trials to de-intensify therapy or things like that. Evaluating it in new combinations with new treatments, with treatments like radiation or chemotherapy or other immune therapies. And then, of course, testing in different settings, like with other types of head and neck cancer, like salivary gland or thyroid cancer, as a preventative strategy for patients at high risk for developing cancer, because we really want to be able to harness these new treatments to really benefit patients at the end of the day. So I'll pause there because I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions, and I'm happy to take questions and discuss. This is our multidisciplinary team, and of course, Dr. Schmitt's team and Dr. Burtness's team and the UT Southwestern team all have these types of multidisciplinary teams as well that really marry optimizing patient outcomes along with trying to improve treatments for head and neck cancer. And I just want to end here with one more thought that I think is quite important, which is that, at the end of the day, as oncologists that treat head and neck cancer, our responsibility at the end of the day is to the patient who's sitting with us in the clinic at the bedside. And, that's, I think, very, very important because every clinical trial, that gets approval, it has that in mind because, the most important thing we want to do is to have patients have the best outcome as possible. And if that means joining a clinical trial, then that's what we do. And if it means not joining a clinical trial, then that's what we recommend. Or if it means stopping the clinical trial that you're on for a different treatment or a different clinical trial, we always want to recommend what we think is going to be best for patients with that in mind. So I will pause there, and thanks for your attention, and thanks to the group, and especially to Tom and Bill for sharing your stories. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Ari. That was a great overview, and it's a good segue to let Jack talk a little bit about how to find a clinical trial.
Thank you, Dr. Schmitt, and thank you, Dr. Rosenberg. That was seriously an excellent explanation of the clinical trial landscape. It's really good information you gave. So as mentioned by Dr. Schmitt, and as mentioned in the intro, I'm the head of marketing for Leal Health, and we are partnered with the Head and Neck Cancer Alliance to help patients access all of their cancer treatment options free of charge. So just as some quick background before I show you how to access the tool, our tool is available for patients in the United States, Canada, and Israel. We are expanding into Europe this coming year. And to date, we've helped over 120,000 patients access their clinical trial options to date. So showing is better than telling. I'm going to pull it up and let's dive right in on how to access it. So anybody at any point can go to headandneck.org and access it via going patient and caregiver resources, clinical trials, clinical trial finder. Okay. Here you'll be greeted with our widget, which at this point, you are able to select your type of cancer, and then you're going to navigate a series of questions. So we cover every stage of the cancer journey, whether it is a newly diagnosed patient, recurrent, metastatic, advanced, any stage, at any stage of the journey, you can come to us and we will help you find your options. And again, you can navigate to this page to find them. So for this example, let's say that we are not responding to a treatment. So patients will be going through a series of questions. On average, our questionnaire takes just under 2 minutes for most patients, as long as you have your medical records available to you. If not, however, you can at any point, let's say, if you don't know an answer, hit the skip button, which is located in the bottom right corner of the page. you'll continue to go through the different questions. So what is the current stage of cancer? Let's say stage 4A. Where do you have disease right now? For example, you can select multiple options. It'll go through testing questions, biopsy, etc. So I'm just going to skip through a couple of these just so everybody can see what this looks like. It's typically a pretty lightweight questionnaire. Again, if anybody doesn't know what something means, you can all click this. What does this mean? Or if you still are unsure, you can always hit the skip button and return to it later. It's asking about biopsies or NGS testing, remove real tumors, treatment options, etc. And so after filling this entire questionnaire, patients are then going to be able to access a page like this. And what this is a list of your personal profile match options. And so the way we work is that once you filled out this questionnaire, we use that information to match you in your exact medical profile with clinical trial opportunities that are available to you based on your diagnosis as well as distance. And so at any point, patients are able to navigate and see the trials that match their profile. They can see the distance from them, the phase of the trial, the estimated participant enrollment target. And they can also see, of course, the type, so immunotherapy, cell therapy, chemotherapy. These are all things that Dr. Rosenberg did touch upon. And then if that's not good enough, you can also always refine by location. So I personally am in New York. At any point, it will take your exact location and it will tell you exactly where the nearest trials are to you. So I can see right here that I do have a clinical trial option, not too far from me. Patients then are also able to, at any point in a trial that they're interested into, navigate to the learn more. This will give them additional information about the study. At that point, they are also able to, at any point, share it with their physician directly. It will send it to their oncologist, care team, whoever you like, and it will alert them that this is an option. You can also download it as a PDF, which can then be shared to your care team, oncologists, friends, family, anybody who you feel needed to. And then at any point, patients are able to get help. So let's say that you are interested in the study. You can always hit the contact button. We will pair you with the exact study coordinator. And then we will also are able to support you directly via our platform. So if patients at any point have any updates to their medical status, anything else, they can always change and update their platform, update their profile rather, to get the nearest and newest options. We also will always be emailing patients about new and latest options that they are relevant for. If there is no matches, which I will say is very, very rare, we will always also make an attempt to reach out to the patient directly via the information you've given us and work with you one-on-one to find an appropriate option. On average, our medical support team or our patient engagement team, which is comprised of MDs, PhDs, and nurse navigators, is spending 4 hours per patient supporting them free of charge. We do not require insurance. We do not require any kind of payment. This is a completely free service that we provide in order to help patients. I'll leave it on that, but I'm always open to answering questions in relation to this as the session goes on.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Jack. That's a fantastic resource. I wish I'd known about it. Now I do. So we're now kind of had a wonderful overview from our survivors and from Dr. Rosenberg about the trials and from Jack about how to find one. And I encourage anybody to ask us any questions for anybody on the panel via the Q&A or via the chat. We've had a couple of questions come in already, and one was in reference to a specific trial and how to know whether a trial in particular is legitimate and what it's trying to ask. And so I think a couple of ways of doing that. And I think using Jack's tool is a wonderful way to do it. And also it seems to link up with something called clinicaltrials.gov, which is where just about any clinical trial in the US and many around the world register the trial. And so you can find a national clinical trial number, and it tells you some of the basics on there. And then again, I would also encourage you, if you have any questions about it and whether you're a good fit for it, to reach out to your doctor. I love the tool that's part of that, where you can just send the link directly to your treating doctor. We always encourage patients to ask us about different options and help you interpret and navigate some of those terminologies. So while questions are coming in, and again, I encourage any of the attendees to ask us anything. I'll kind of kick off some discussion. I think it's always good when you have physicians and patients on the same setting to kind of talk about what I think is fascinating is a disconnect between what we as the doctors feel is important and what the patients feel is important. And sometimes it's not the same thing. So I'd love to just kind of in turn ask Dr. Rosenberg and then our survivors, Bill and Tom, what do you see as the barriers to this and why isn't everyone participating? And I'd be curious to see if we're all on the same page or if we're not. So Dr. Rosenberg, you want to go in blind and tell us what do you see as the barriers to participation and what would help us get more people involved?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that question. And I look forward to hearing what Bill and Tom's thoughts are as well. I think there's many potential barriers, right? I mean, clinical trials, involve not only treatment for the cancer with whatever program is being evaluated in terms of a new treatment to try to optimize those kinds of outcomes, but also, collecting the information that is needed to evaluate a new treatment. That means asking about side effects and collecting all the side effects in a very regimented way. It means sometimes collecting blood tests over the course of treatment that can be used to figure out if, who the treatment is best for or who it's not best for. Sometimes it means doing, extra scans. I think Bill mentioned, in his discussion that, the program that he was on involved extra scans to make sure that the AI algorithm for the radiation had the information it needed to do the, personalized radiation. So, I think that's one potential barrier on one hand for some patients, which is, the extra inconvenience, I guess, for lack of a better term, of being involved in a clinical trial. The flip side of that, I will say though, is that, it, because of that extra data collection piece, there is a whole additional set of staff that are specifically there to support the clinical trial, which means from a patient's perspective that there are an extra set of hands to help with the coordination and to bounce questions out of and to, do all sorts of things related to what is complex oncology care. And that can also provide a benefit for patients, right? Because that staff supporting that clinical trial are only supporting that clinical trial and not patients that are being treated with standard of care. So I think that's an important thing. And I think something that some people cite when they look at patients that, get clinical trial treatment versus non-clinical trial treatment as maybe having a real impact because it can help facilitate things. So there are many, many other barriers to talk about, but I'll pause there so that Bill and Tom have a chance for their views as well.
Yeah, I think that is all true. That some people perceive there's extra hassle, there's extra visits, there's extra travel and extra. Some people are concerned about extra expense, and the traditional way is for the trial to pay for everything that's not standard, and the other things are billed to insurance that are standard. But there's concerns about that, and some and for me in Atlanta, one of my biggest barriers is distance, because we see people from all over the state of Georgia, and sometimes it's really difficult for them to come in for travel. But Bill and Tom, were either of you ever hesitant to enroll, or when considering the trial that you did do, or others, and what were the concerns that you had, and how were those addressed, if any?
Well, I'll start since Tom started last time. I'll just give you one thing that came to mind as Dr. Rosenberg was talking, and there is a philanthropical part of this, and I think and that's a good thing. But yeah, they're telling you at the time that you're going to have extra pokes and you're going to have extra scans and you're going to be here more than you would have been. And I think part of if you're asking about what might be some reluctance, is at the time that this is presented to you, I think would be safe to say you're in self-defense mode. Like you probably have just gotten diagnosed within a day or two or week of this being presented, and a lot of this is at the moment of that you're really thinking about self-preservation to some degree, and to extend out to something like that may, is outside of that. It does take a little bit of expansion of what you're thinking about at the moment. And so there, I could see that a sort of self-preservation thing where I'm like, I just want to get through this, kind of thing, and survive, as opposed to doing something that's going to require extra effort. But I do think the timing of it is hard to avoid, because that's when you need to get involved. So that certainly is, all this is coming at you. There's a lot of information coming at you at that point in the treatment. And so there's a lot to sort through, and I could see where that could be a barrier, in my opinion.
That's very true. Thank you for that. Tom, do you have any other insights into that?
Yeah, I just saw a couple of questions on there. I think it's amazing, just since I was treated in 2015, just in the 8 years alone, that those tools, the AI tools, weren't available, and a lot of that. So the fact that they're available now is actually quite comforting. I mean, I was just in a room, and just as the other had mentioned, you're kind of in a shock, right? You're like, oh my God, it's like you're focusing on, am I going to live? Am I going to die? My family and all that. So to have the clinical trial presented to me the way that it was, now it just seems like there's so much more data, right? I think the doctors are more embracing of this, and I think a couple of questions where one ENT was resistant to that, and I think to answer that person's question is, I think the most important thing is, don't Google things, use the important platforms to do your research, the organizations that do the research, and consider it, because again, in my place, as I mentioned before, what I went through versus the other person that I mentored through, just that 1 week was a considerable difference. And that was also a question that was presented there. I am not a doc. I am just a cancer survivor. But I do encourage every person going through this to really evaluate every option they have, and to consider it, right? And not having a provider allow it or consider it seems a little odd to me. It is your life, it's your decision. And I think it's just important to that. I'm just thankful that for me, at least for my case, that it was a success. And I'll see if there's any other questions. I'll pop up here and see if there's any other ones. Go ahead. Back to you.
And somebody asked a really good question. I think that Dr. Rosenberg's already answered it kind of in the chat, but thoughts on T-cell therapy and targeted therapies, and just kind of, those are the kind of hottest things. And did you want to kind of touch a little bit on each of those and what those are?
Yeah, definitely. So, T-cell therapy, or, is usually, so there's many different types, right? So T cells are a type of immune cell in the body. And T cells appear to be the type of immune cells that are probably most important, generally speaking, in attacking cancer cells. And so T cell therapy generally refers to a type of immune therapy, a little bit different than the one that I talked about, which is the drug that releases the brakes, where the T cells or the immune cells, there's a couple different types, but usually it's referring to removing the T cells from the body, taking them, engineering them to specifically target your cancer cell, and then being infused back, oftentimes with other treatments, et cetera. It's been a type of therapy that's been very successful for a number of different types of blood cancers, for example, leukemia, some types of lymphoma, and it's being evaluated for head and neck cancer as well. I will say it's still in clinical trials for head and neck cancer. It's not approved right now for head and neck cancer. So if it's appropriate for you, you should ask your doctor about it and see if it's right for you, because there's a lot of factors that may go into that. Targeted therapies, on the other hand, generally refer to, again, it's a non-specific term. It generally refers to a drug that specifically targets, hence the name, some specific mutation in your cancer. So we, for example, know that genetic mutations in cancer cells are what drive the growth for head and neck cancer and other types of cancer as well. And so targeted therapies are saying, well, if we have this mutation that's driving the cancer, then this is a drug that may potentially block that particular driver and may work. So oftentimes those are trials that require you to have some specific mutation or change in your tumor that qualifies you for that clinical trial or makes the study team think that that drug would work against your specific cancer. Again, the only type of targeted therapy that we have that's sort of FDA approved is a drug called cetuximab, which is a targeted therapy that targets a protein called EGFR, which is increased in a large number of head and neck cancers. But there's a number of other clinical trials evaluating new and different types of targeted therapies that may be more specific, but all of those are potentially good options. They're ones that you should either look through Jack's platform and see if there's one of those that fit the criteria in your area, or ask your treating oncologist about whether one of those trials might be available to you.
Thank you so much. All right, there was another couple other questions. One is, that as a person said they had a negative experience where their doctor's really negative about the trial and really not optimistic about that. Is that common amongst ENT doctors? Well, I'm an ENT doctor, so I hope not. But I'm also an ENT doctor that practices really only in the oncology space, and I at a specialized center. So to that end, I think a lot of it has to do with familiarity and finding a treatment team that's familiar with that. And so I think, in general, if you can get an opinion at a dedicated cancer center, then you may find that there are a lot of options there. So sorry if anybody had that experience. Other questions on somebody who's already in the midst of treatment and almost done. Keep going. You're doing great. and is it too late to do a trial? And the answer that Jack wrote back that I agree with is it's never too late. It might be a different type of trial where you may not want to shorten your treatment or change it now when you're almost done, but there are wonderful trials that look at sort of helping with side effects after your treatment. As a give an example, there was a trial in Europe that I thought was really neat where patients who had a lot of fibrosis of their skin after radiation were put on a cholesterol drug, and about half of those patients had reversal of their skin fibrosis with this cholesterol drug, which is wonderful. So it's never too late because we care not so much just about the treatment that you're having to hopefully cure your cancer, but as Dr. Rosenberg mentioned, some of the side effects, and sometimes you can work on those even after you've already completed it. Somebody else brought up a trial for swallowing dysfunction after therapy. So there's a lot of things that can be done before, during, and after standard therapies, which is a great thing. Other questions that people ask, I'm sort of going through. Another one. Have you looked at how healthy diet, such as plant-based diet, can strengthen the immune system and heal cancer cells along with juicing? I have a personal anecdote about that where I had a patient of mine with a really aggressive skin cancer who cured herself in 3 weeks by eating fruit. So there are these, anybody who works in oncology has seen some anecdotal case where that has happened. And actually, she inspired me to start studying blueberry extract in my lab. And so we actually give these mice with tumors blueberry extract in their water, and it actually works as well as the PD-1 immunotherapy that you heard about. So stay tuned. And again, it's everything like that, leads us to be inspired to do more research, and maybe in a couple of years, it'll be a clinical trial, and that's how we learn, and that's how we find out. But there's definitely some data to suggest that a healthy plant-based diet is good for you, not just when you have cancer. And trying to see if there's any other questions or comments that anybody had about any of those so far that has been brought up. Yeah, somebody else brought up the same question about what about ongoing troubles, and there definitely are trials for that. So I encourage you to look for those and ask your oncologist for that. Maybe try using Jack's tool for that as well. And then Dr. Rosenberg, there's a question for you. Any trials you're aware of for HPV positive oropharyngeal cancer that have metastasized distantly? Sure, there are many actually. I don't know if you want to elaborate on some of the maybe general strategies or.
Yeah. I think, there are many different trials that probably the appropriate one will depend on what previous treatments, a patient has received, and some of the other specifics, related to their particular case. So it may be a I would suggest being evaluated in a place that has a lot of clinical trials to look at the whole picture and figure out, which one might be appropriate. Many of the trials for HPV positive oropharynx cancer that has metastasized are focusing on trying to improve on immunotherapy. So some of them are related to immune therapies that are targeted specifically towards HPV cancer, which is one of the trials that we have here at University of Chicago, as well as other places. Some are strategies that are focused on targeting specific mutations that are more commonly seen with HPV-related cancers. A number of the trials are trying to figure out what the best way is to combine immunotherapy with chemotherapy and using new blood tests and things like that to improve outcomes for patients in that regard. And then many of them are looking at, other types of immune therapy combined with radiation or with treatments that may make the immune therapy work better than by itself. So that's just sort of a flavor of some of the strategies that are being evaluated, but there's many, many clinical trials, and it's worth being evaluated by a clinical trial team to figure out what the best may be for your particular situation, is what I would say about that.
That's a good point. And I think another person brought up the fact that sometimes it's overwhelming, and how do we deal with the overwhelming number of clinical trials? It's wonderful to have so many options, but it was brought up that having a lot of information about your particular cancer, being able to interpret the CT scan reports and everything else, and be able to enter the data into a tool like Jack is presenting. But then how do you kind of sift through some of those? Does anybody have any comments about that?
In terms of sifting through the records?
Yeah, just kind of, what happens if you get overwhelmed and it becomes too expansive.
Yeah, and so that's really, honestly and truly, that's the big value add of Leal Health as a platform, and that's a big part of the partnership here, is that we are reducing that overload. So instead of a patient having to sort through, and I think I said in the beginning, over 19,000 clinical trial options, they can just fill out their medical profile, and it will be refined down to a much more manageable number. On average, our patients are only getting between 10 and 15 matches. That's a lot more manageable than thousands. And so we reduce that kind of overwhelming feeling, that feeling of, impending dread of going through all this information when you're already going through one of the hardest times of your life. And to that end, even if that, let's say, list of 10 is still overwhelming, we have a whole team on standby that can help you through it. We will go one by one with you. We will work through and identify A to Z what your requirements are for treatment that works for you. How far are you willing to travel? Do you require financial assistance? Do you require somebody like take care of your kids, babysitting, lodging, anything like that? We will work with you to make sure that the treatment opportunities that are relevant to you are only shown, and that they match the situation, not just on a medical criteria side, but also just a financial and a lifestyle criteria side. We don't want anybody traveling across the country just to get a treatment that they need to save their life. That's unfair to everybody.
Yeah, those are great points, Jack, and some of the barriers that we kind of were touching on earlier, distance and some of the logistics and cost, not just of the trial, but the getting there, and some of those are some major hurdles. See, somebody else here is asking about, Keytruda, which is also known as pembrolizumab, or a PD-1 inhibitor for treating recurrent squamous cell carcinoma of the larynx. And I think Dr. Rosenberg and I have both seen patients treated with that, and it certainly depends on the case and how extensive the recurrence is. Any comments on that, Ari?
No, I mean, for larynx cancer, like we sort of hinted at, that's come back locally or distantly. Oftentimes, Keytruda is an appropriate treatment option. But again, it depends with some of the specifics. One of the most important things, putting the clinical trial aside for a minute, that I think Dr. Schmitt referenced a little bit is, all of these cases really need to be evaluated by a multidisciplinary head and neck cancer team. That means head and neck surgeon or ENT like Dr. Schmitt, a medical oncologist like myself, and a radiation oncologist, because a lot of it depends on many of the specifics of your previous treatment. That actually I think is very, very important. And if there's a good clinical trial, great. And if a different treatment approach is needed, then that's great as well. This also goes to, I think, the other point that I just want to touch on as well that was brought up about, reluctance towards clinical trials. A good multidisciplinary treatment team that treats a lot of head and neck cancer, they want the best outcome for your patient. And that means, if that means surgery with Dr. Schmitt, then that's the right treatment, and if it means doing some chemotherapy and immunotherapy first and then doing surgery, then that's the right treatment, So, I think we all want to figure out which of the tools available are going to be best for your outcome. And, and I'll support you in doing that. I think that's very important. We all want what's best for you. So that's what I think is my perspective as a multidisciplinary team member.
That is so key, because it really depends on each patient is very individualized and has different nuances to their case. And it really takes a group of us with different perspectives on surgery and medical therapy and radiation therapy to figure out how is this patient most likely going to be cancer-free and functional. And it really is that, take that multidisciplinary team. And some centers do that in real time in a clinic. That's how we do it in our center. And some people do that at a tumor board once or twice a week, where they discuss multiple cases, and you get a lot of people in the room to offer different perspectives and ideas. And so it's a very collaborative. Cancer is a very collaborative thing, and it involves collaboration from patients and families as well. So I think that's an absolutely critical point. And we have another question here about, with somebody who's, considering, Dr. Rosenberg, I think is answering it, what are the questions to ask when, considering immunotherapy or other options after, you've had a recurrence, and it's hard to know, but I mean, again, hopefully a multidisciplinary team will kind of discuss that and any other options for your particular case, which is really key.
Yeah. I mean, I would ask, what are the treatment options that you would suggest? What are they? And make sure they're very clear in your mind. What are the potential benefits to each of those treatment options, whether clinical trial or otherwise? What are some of the side effects anticipated with the various different treatment options? I think all of those are good questions to ask at your consult. So good luck.
Might just add to for that question, to have some support if you can with you. You're getting a lot of information, and I know we all try to take notes, but to have another set of ears hearing those answers is something that could be beneficial to you later on as you're sorting through a lot of technical information in your brain and wanting to make good decisions. So having a good support team is pretty important if you're so fortunate as I was to have.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great point. Sorry, Nikki.
Oh, I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, which is a very, very good point. It's always better to have someone with you. I completely agree. The other thing is that, and this may be specific, or I'd say even more so with clinical trials, but clinical trials, if you're considering enrolling, has a consent form and a consent process, which is very useful to you as a patient, because the clinical trial consent is a document that is packed with useful information. And, I often, tell patients, especially if they're coming in for like an initial consult and they're hearing about the clinical trial for the first time, you don't have to consent on the spot, actually. In fact, you can take that clinical trial consent home with you and read through it page by page and circle stuff and think of questions as you're reading through it and things, because it's all written there, and sometimes people need to digest things. So that's something that's very reasonable as well. So I find that, because you don't always know that that's coming, but it is coming. So you're going to have this nice document that's going to be packed with information that you can take home and think about and read about and get information about. So that's the other thing I wanted to add to that.
Yeah, that's something you brought up, Bill, earlier when you're telling your story is information overload. How are you supposed to kind of think critically through whether you want to participate in something that's, investigational and new when you've just been bombarded with information. And so to Dr. Rosenberg's point, and also the consent form is written in lay terms so that it's not full of medical jargon. And sometimes we just, it's wonderful to have a family member there, just like you said, to take notes and just kind of be there for emotional support and also informational support, quite honestly. And often what we do is just say, hey, this is something we have. Here's the consent form. I'm just going to give it to you and let you take it home and think about it and read about it and write down what questions you have. And we usually give you a number to contact a coordinator as a lifeline when you know what questions you have, because quite honestly, in the beginning, that first day, you don't necessarily know what questions you're going to have. So support is key, and it's really designed in a way to give you time to answer to ask questions that you need. So anyway, I think these are wonderful questions. If any of that we haven't answered quite yet in the chat, we will. There will be a mechanism to which we will answer those offline, and those will be posted along with the video of the webinar. So that's here's some information on that. I just really want to thank all of our panelists. Dr. Rosenberg, for your information, our head and neck cancer ambassadors, Tom Bennett and Bill Kaysen, for being with us and sharing your story tonight. I know it's hard to relive all that, and we really appreciate your perspective for other patients. To Jack Gierlich for also telling us about this wonderful tool that that many of us will plan to use in future and how to interpret that. And also, again, our staff and team from Head and Neck Cancer Alliance and from the American Head and Neck Society for their time organizing and hosting this wonderful webinar on navigating head and neck cancer clinical trials. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of our attendees for tuning in.